year of 1860, there had been decades of compromises and laws and acts and Supreme Court cases that had occurred in America over a single issue: slavery, and how to maintain the power of balance between those states where slavery was prohibited by law and the states where slavery was allowable by law. And in 1860, there would be a presidential election, and running in that election will be Abraham Lincoln. Now, when we examine Abraham Lincoln from our 2020 perspective, we recognize him for what he was: one of the greatest, if not the greatest, American presidents in all of our history. He was inaugurated under the most difficult of times. He kept a steady hand and a keen wit during 4 turbulent, disastrous years of our country. Now, in 1860, people didn't see Lincoln that way. People in the southern states had a big distrust for Lincoln. They thought that he would bring an end to slave labor, and their economy hinged on slavery. Now, Lincoln had said while he was running, he wasn't going to end slavery where it existed. He didn't believe that our nation would endure half free and half slave. He said we've got to become all of one thing or all of the other. Now, Lincoln, he didn't hide his personal distaste for slavery. He had had a life-changing moment as a young man when he had taken a riverboat or a flatboat down the Mississippi, and it was in New Orleans that he would witness firsthand the nightmare of a slave market and slave auction, and those images were burned into his memory. He had a personal dislike for slavery. Nevertheless, he made it clear he didn't want to end slavery where it existed, but he certainly didn't want it to spread to these new territories that were becoming states. Well, when the election is held, even if you had wanted to vote for Lincoln in the South, you couldn't have. They left his name off the ballot. And when the election is over, in spite of not appearing on any ballot in the South, Lincoln is elected President of the United States. And by the time he is sworn in as the 16th president of our nation, our country has started to unravel. South Carolina is going to do what it's threatened to do many times. Even when Andrew Jackson was president, South Carolina threatened to secede, and several other states are going to join them. Now, secede means break apart or tear away from, and what they were going to break apart from was the United States of America. South Carolinians and the other states were going to declare their independence from the United States of America, and they were going to form a loose confederation of states, the Confederate States of America. Now, Tennessee would hold a vote on secession. Would Tennessee secede and join this new alliance of states, or would they remain loyal to the United States? And when the initial vote is held, Tennessee votes to stay in the United States. Now, the vote kind of shook out like this. East Tennessee and Middle Tennessee are going to vote to stay with the nation. And West Tennessee, where the number of slaves is the most highly concentrated, they are going to vote to secede. When the vote is over, like I said, Tennessee votes to stay in the Union. Well, then, on April 12, 1861, the opening shots of the American Civil War were going to be fired. Fort Sumter was located in the Charleston Harbor off the coast of South Carolina. And by the South Carolinian logic, since they were no longer part of the United States, that fort belonged to them and not to the federal government. And they issue a demand for the federal troops in that fort to vacate or evacuate and turn that fort over to them. Lincoln ignores their demands, and when the deadline comes by which the federal troops were to be gone, and they were still there, the opening shots of the American Civil War would be fired in the wee hours of the morning on April the 12th. Now, the Battle of Fort Sumter would go on for a few hours, and in the end, the Federal troops will evacuate that fort. No one was killed, no one was injured, and it gave a false sense of hope to the Confederates. Hey, this is going to be a piece of cake. Look how easily Sumter fell. We're going to gain our independence like that. Fort Sumter turned out to be a bloodless opening to the bloodiest war in all of American history. Now, after Fort Sumter, Lincoln's going to put out a call for volunteers. He's going to ask for men to join the army in order to squash the Southern Rebellion, not to invade the South, not to free slaves, but to keep the United States together. And when the governor, Isham Harris, receives this call for volunteers from Tennessee, he's going to send back a telegram to Lincoln saying, we won't provide a single man for your cause, but we'll provide tens of thousands to protect our state from you if we need to. You know, he's really whipped up because he was for secession. And then he calls for a special meeting of the General Assembly. We're going to vote again on this thing. Lincoln wants these troops to invade us and bring an end to our way of life. And this time, in April of 1861, when a vote is held for Tennessee to secede, Tennessee votes yes on secession and becomes the final state to secede from America and join this confederation of states made up of southern states. And this time, the way the vote hinged was this. Middle Tennessee would largely go with West Tennessee and vote for secession. East Tennessee would remain loyal to the United States for the duration of the war. These were the grandsons of the men who had fought the Battle of Kings Mountain with George Washington. They knew the sacrifices that had been made to get this nation started, and they weren't willing to be a party to the undoing of that. Now, East Tennessee would find many men who would side to fight with the Union once the war began. Voting to join the Confederate States. You can see here in this map, the dark gray states are the states that voted to secede as soon as Lincoln was elected, and the light gray states are the states that seceded after the Battle of Fort Sumter. And what a terrible and disastrous decision for those states. In 4 years, 700,000 men would be dead. The entire Southern economy destroyed, and it would take the better part of a century to recover from that. Mary Chestnut kept a diary during the war, and her diary today is considered one of the best primary sources on the events that occurred between 1861 and 1865. And she and her husband moved in these circles where they were friends with the people in high power of this new Confederate States of America. She was living in Charleston when the opening shots of the war were fired, and she wrote in her diary on April 12, 1861, when I heard the first shots, I fell to my knees in prayer and prayed like I've never prayed before. And then she added, woe unto you who inaugurated this terrible war, for it will have been in earnest.